What is marital property, also known as assets and liabilities, and how is it divided? Tune in as Attorney Joseph Marra explains.
Sometimes one spouse may be keeping things secret from the other spouse. Uh, let's talk about property and how it's divided, because basically there's people think about them, their child support, they think about their maintenance or alimony, and then there's property. And bottom line is, from the moment you get married, all property that's accumulated is marital property. And when you file for divorce, that property has to get divided. Now, with a long-term marriage, generally longer than 10 years, that marital property is generally split 50-50. Right? That's the general rule. That's the basic rule. The shorter the term the marriage, there might be a different split. So I've had, some men come in and say, well, I've been the breadwinner. I've accumulated all this money. Well, it really doesn't matter. Unless you have a prenuptial agreement, it doesn't matter. Whatever you accumulated during the marriage, it's marital property. It gets divided, period. Now, people say, well, I came into the marriage with assets. Well, if you protect them, protect those assets you came into the marriage with, don't commingle them with your spouse, keep them separate. Yeah, you could protect those particular assets. There are other things that might factor in. What happens if someone had a personal injury during the marriage and they collected money? Well, part of that is going to be attributed to the spouse as, loss of consortium claim generally. But the majority of it is going to be the spouse who was injured's funds. And they're going to be able to keep that, once again, if they keep it separate. There's another thing you have to be concerned about with property, and that's retirement benefits. Because once again, from the moment you are married, the moment you say I do, whatever retirement assets, 401k assets, IRAs, pensions, those assets become marital property and they get split when you get divorced. So we should talk about liabilities as well, in addition to assets. The marital liabilities you incur also get divided. So if you're married to someone and they have incurred a lot of debt during the marriage, well, you're going to be responsible for some of that. Now, there's also something called a wasting of marital assets. If, say, someone knows they're going to go out and get divorced and they purposely run up the credit card bill and you can establish that, well, that's going to be considered a wasting of marital assets and it might be pinned back on them. But general rule, and we're just talking generalities now because each case is very different. General rule, your liabilities, your debts, credit card bills, mortgages, car loans, all of that all goes into the pool. You say, well, that's on his car, not on my car. That's her car, not my car. Doesn't matter. All the debts are put and assets are put in one pool that are accumulated during the marriage, and they're divided. Once again, if someone has separate property, because New York does recognize separate property, they came into the marriage with separate property, that could be separated out. If someone wasted marital assets, well, that could be separated out as well. But generally speaking, assets you accumulate, debts you accumulate during the marriage are split. People sometimes wonder, well, when does that end? Like, when do we stop this split? Another general rule is once the lawsuit is filed, so once you file the summons and complaint with the court, that's generally the dividing line. Once again, the courts have discretion to move that dividing line to another time, and that dividing line can be moved based on negotiation. But general rule, once you file the summons and complaint, that's the measuring point. So it's the date of marriage until the date the summons and complaint is filed. What were the assets? How were they accumulated? What were the debts? How were they accumulated? They're divided as of that point. Two things I did want to go into: marital property versus non-marital property. Remember I said initially that from the moment you get married, the property you accumulate is marital property. That's what goes into the pot and then gets divided. And the percentage of division, as I said earlier, depends on how long you're married and other factors. Long-term marriage, general rule, 50% split of marital property. But what if you say, well, you know what? I had my business running long before I met my wife. It's my business. She's not involved in the business. Then what? Well, that business can be considered separate property. However, if the wife then contributed to the business somehow, a portion of it could be considered marital property. Or if she had children, you had children with this person and the other person stayed home as primary caregiver, even you've split caregiving 50-50, it could be argued that any appreciation value of your business is marital property. What if you have bank accounts? I have $100,000 in the bank before I got married. If you want it to be separate property, keep it separate property. There's a doctrine in New York called transmutation, right? Basically, if you start putting things in joint names, it loses its separate character. So you have separate property, keep it separate. Stock is another thing, stock portfolios. If it's just you have stock there and it's nothing happening with it, I mean, you don't manage it. You have X number of shares of IBM or whatever, and they're just sitting there. That's going to be separate property. If you have a stock portfolio that you actively manage, buy and trade, well, part of that could be considered marital property, the appreciation if it's gone up in value. If you have separate property, keep it separate. One exception to that is, let's say you buy a house together and you put in $100,000. Well, usually they'll back that out because you could say, I put $100,000 into the house. That's yours. So before the house is divided, that gets split. That gets taken out, then the split happens, I should say. So that's one of the exceptions if you're contributing money to a marital residence. Generally, you can back that money out as separate property. Put $100,000 into the marital residence. When it's sold or when you get divorced, back that money out. Take the $100,000 out before the rest is split.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that important information. And thank you, audience, for watching. If you yourself or someone you know may have questions on this topic, please don't hesitate to pick up the phone and call the law offices of Joseph Marra. They are professional, friendly, and really great at looking at the pros and cons of your situation, coming up with a fantastic strategy, and giving you some options. We look forward to hearing from you soon.